The storm came first, then came the debt, then came the stranger. In the unforgiving lands of Texas, Abigail Preston is given 30 days to save her dying sister before a corrupt judge destroys everything she loves. Desperate and alone, she agrees to a dangerous bargain with a mysterious cowboy she barely knows. But the man she marries is hiding a secret powerful enough to shake the entire county. As betrayal, love, revenge, and redemption collide beneath the endless western sky, Abby and Arthur must face the ghosts of their past before they lose their future forever. And trust me, the ending will stay with you long after the final word. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to join us for more unforgettable Western stories.
The rain in Texas doesn't fall, it hits. It comes down in thick gray sheets, turning the dust into a slick, unforgiving mud that sticks to your boots and weighs you down. Abigail Preston stood ankle-deep in it. She didn't shiver. She just stared at the wooden door of the house she grew up in. There was a heavy iron padlock on it now. In her right hand, shielded barely by the edge of her wool shawl, was a piece of paper. The ink was already bleeding at the edges. A promissory note. $3,200. Her father had signed it 2 years ago. He died 2 days ago. And now, the house belonged to Judge Silas Thorne. Abby folded the damp paper. She slipped it into the pocket of her skirt. She was 34 years old. She had spent 2 of those years wading through the blood and mud of Civil War medical tents. She had held men as they took their last breaths. She knew what defeat looked like, and she knew you didn't have time to cry over a locked door, not when there was a worse sound waiting for her down the street. A cough. It was a wet, rattling sound. It echoed from the back room of Mrs. Gable S. boarding house, just above the apothecary. Abby pushed open the door to the rented room. The air inside was heavy, damp. It smelled of eucalyptus and stale sweat. On the narrow cot in the corner lay Sarah, 19 years old, pale as milk glass. Sarah held a handkerchief to her mouth, her thin shoulders shaking with the effort of breathing. When Sarah pulled the cloth away, there was a bright, angry speck of red on the white cotton. Dr. Evans was standing by the wash basin. He was an old man. He had kind eyes, which was usually a bad sign. Kind eyes meant he was out of medicine and out of hope. The dampness is settling in her lungs, Abby, Dr. Evans said. His voice was a low rumble. This town sits too low. The air is too wet. The tuberculosis is taking root. What do we do? Abby asked. Her voice was flat, steady, a nurse's voice. She needs the high country, he said, drying his hands. She needs the dry air out west on the big ranges. Sun, meat every day, rest. If she stays in this room, in this town, she won't see Christmas. Abby nodded slowly. How much time? A month, the doctor said. Maybe 2 if the weather turns. But she can't stay here. He packed his black bag, tipped his hat, and slipped out the door. He didn't ask for his fee. That was the worst sign of all. Abby sat on the edge of the bed. She took a cool cloth and wiped the sweat from Sarah's forehead. Sarah leaned into her hand, her breathing shallow. I'm sorry, Abby, Sarah whispered. Don't be foolish, Abby said softly. You just rest. Before she could say another word, the floorboards in the hallway groaned. Heavy boots. A sharp knock on the doorframe. It was Mr. Higgins. Higgins was a small, sharp-featured man who wore suits that cost more than a horse. He was Judge Silas Thorne's right hand, the man who delivered the bad news and collected the blood money. He didn't bother taking off his hat. He stepped into the room, looking at the peeling wallpaper with clear disgust. Miss Preston, Higgins said. He pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest, checked it, and snapped it shut. I trust you understand the situation. The late Mr. Preston's debts are now yours. $3,200. I saw the note, Abby said. She stood up. She kept herself between Higgins and her sister's bed. Good. Then you know you have exactly 30 days to clear the balance, Higgins said, a smirk playing on his thin lips. The judge is a reasonable man. But the law is the law. If the debt isn't paid, we will have to make alternative arrangements. What arrangements? Abby asked. Her jaw tightened. Higgins glanced past her at Sarah. Your sister is clearly a burden on you, and a public health hazard. Unpaid debtors without a home are wards of the county. She will be relocated to the county workhouse. It's an act of charity, really. The workhouse. It was a dark, unheated stone building on the edge of the county line. Hard labor. Spoiled food. For a girl with failing lungs, it was a death sentence, and Higgins knew it. She is sick, Abby said, her voice dropping an octave. She wouldn't last a week in the workhouse. Higgins shrugged. It was a cold, practiced movement. That is the way of the world, Miss Preston. It's unfortunate, but let's be realistic. You're a widow, a woman alone. There is no job in Texas that will pay a woman $3,000 in 30 days. You don't have the means, the mind, or the muscle. It's a man's game. Accept your lot. Hand her over to the county when the time comes. Something snapped inside Abby. It wasn't panic. It was absolute, blinding clarity. She stepped forward. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't yell. But the sheer force of her presence made Higgins take a half step backward. Listen to me, Mr. Higgins, Abby said. Her words were sharp, deliberate. They cut through the damp air like a cavalry saber. A woman's intellect and labor are no less valuable than a man's simply because she wears a skirt. Higgins blinked. He opened his mouth to speak, but Abby didn't let him. I have stood in tents where men bled exactly the same, whether they were generals or privates, Abby continued, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. I have put bodies back together. Do not stand in my home and tell me what a woman is capable of. More importantly, you will not use my sister's illness as leverage. She took another step, forcing Higgins into the hallway. My sister's right to life, her right to clean air and health care, is a fundamental human right. It belongs to her because she breathes. It is not a privilege for the wealthy. It is not a bargaining chip for Judge Thorne's political chessboard. You tell the judge that human lives are not property to be seized. I will pay this debt, but I will not let you strip us of our dignity to do it. Higgins stared at her. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, ugly scowl. 30 days, Miss Preston, he spat. Dignity doesn't pay the bank. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing down the wooden stairs. Abby closed the door. The silence in the room rushed back in, broken only by the steady, terrifying sound of Sarah's raspy breathing. Abby walked over to the small cracked mirror above the wash basin. She looked at herself, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes that had seen too much. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the promissory note. $3,200. 30 days. She needs the high country, the doctor had said. The dry air out west on the big ranges. Abby looked out the small, rain-streaked window, out past the edge of town, out toward the western horizon. That was where the massive cattle ranches were, the Montgomery lands. Tens of thousands of acres of dry grass, rolling hills, and deep pockets. They needed hands out there, fencers, cooks, cleaners, laborers. She didn't care what the job was. She would dig ditches. She would scrub floors until her knuckles bled. She would walk onto the biggest ranch in Texas, find the foreman, and demand a job and an advance. She would work 3 shifts a day if she had to. She turned back to Sarah. Her sister had fallen into a restless sleep. Abby walked to the corner. She picked up her heavy canvas coat. She pulled it on, buttoning it all the way to her chin. She tied a thick leather scarf around her neck. I'll be back, Sarah, Abby whispered to the quiet room. I promise. She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. Outside, the rain was still falling, cold, relentless. Abby pulled her hat down low. She stepped off the porch and let the mud swallow her boots. She didn't look back at the town. She just started walking west. 5 miles to the edge of the Montgomery Ranch. 5 miles to save a life. She put one foot in front of the other, and she marched into the storm. 5 miles, it doesn't sound like much. Not when you sitting in a parlor. But walking it is a different story, especially after a rainstorm. The mud clung to Abby's boots. It dried into a heavy gray crust. Every step felt like lifting an anvil. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The land changed as she walked west. The cramped, sodden streets of Dry Creek gave way to open country. The air shifted. It lost that wet, rotting smell. It smelled like sagebrush, like dust and wind. This was the high country. This was Montgomery land. Abby followed the fence line. It stretched out forever, wooden posts and barbed wire cutting a hard line across the Texas plains. She was looking for the main house, or a bunkhouse, anywhere there was a foreman with a ledger and a need for cheap labor. Instead, she found a shack. It sat near a break in the fence. A rundown, weathered wooden box. The roof sagged. The porch looked like a strong wind would turn it to splinters. A man was working outside. He had his back to her. He was tall, broad across the shoulders. He wore a faded blue shirt, stained dark with sweat down the spine. He was swinging a heavy wooden mallet, driving a fence post deep into the hard dirt. Thwack, he breathed out. Thwack. He didn't look like a rich man. He looked like a man who knew how to bleed for $1. Abby guessed he was the foreman, or a line rider. A man named Arthur, maybe. She had heard the men in town talk about a hard-nosed Montgomery foreman. Abby walked up to the fence. Excuse me, she said. The man stopped. He lowered the mallet. He turned around. He was in his early 40s. His face was weathered, lined by the sun and wind. He had dark hair, dusted with gray at the temples. His eyes were pale, sharp blue, like winter sky. They locked onto her, taking her in, muddy boots, wet skirt, tired shoulders. He didn't say a word. He just waited. Are you the foreman here? Abby asked. He wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand. I run things around here. Yes. I need work, Abby said. She didn't dress it up. She didn't beg. I don't care what it is. I can mend fences. I can muck out stalls. I can cook for 20 men. I can stitch a wound if one of your hands catches a knife or a bad fall. He leaned on the fence post. He looked at her hands. He saw the red, raw knuckles. This is heavy work out here. It breaks men. It'll break you. I've been broken before, Abby said flatly. I put myself back together. I can do the work. He studied her face. Why the rush? You look like the devil is on your heels. Judge Silas Thorne is on my heels, Abby said. My father died, left a debt, $3,200. I have 30 days to pay it. If I don't, the judge is taking my little sister and putting her in the county workhouse. She has consumption. The workhouse will kill her. The man's pale eyes narrowed. The mention of Judge Thorne did something to his face. It hardened, turned to stone. $300, he said slowly. You won't earn that mucking stalls. Not in 30 days. Not in 30 years. I can ask for an advance, Abby said, her voice tightening. I'll sign a contract. 5 years, 10, I'll work it off. No ranch will. Take that risk, he said. It wasn't cruel. It was just a fact. Abby swallowed hard. Wind picked up, rattling the dry grass. She looked down at her muddy boots. The panic was right there, sitting at the bottom of her throat. She pushed it down. Then, tell me who will. I'm not walking away. The man set the mallet down. He walked over to the fence. He stood very close. What's your name? he asked. Abigail Preston. They call me Abby. Listen to me, Abby, he said. His voice was low, quiet. I don't have wage work for you. I don't have $3,000 in a payroll box to advance you. Abby closed her eyes. The hope flared and died in the same second. But, he continued, I have a problem of my own, and you might be the answer. Abby opened her eyes. She looked at him. What kind of problem? A legal one, he said. Judge Thorne, the same man breathing down your neck. He pushed a new law through the county, the Single Owner Land Seizure Act. It allows the county to force a sale of borderlands if the owner is unmarried and deemed unproductive. It's a land grab. He wants this western ridge. The only way to stop him from tying this land up in court is if the title is held by a married couple. Abby frowned. You want me to find you a wife? I am looking at her, he said. The wind blew. The silence stretched between them. Abby stared at the man in the faded shirt, at his calloused hands, at the sagging shack behind him. You want me to marry you, she said. It wasn't a question. On paper, he said. A legal contract. 2 years. That's how long it will take to appeal the law in Austin and get Thorne thrown off the bench. We sign a marriage certificate. You live on the property. We act like husband and wife when the judge or his men come around. And in return? Abby asked. Her voice was pure ice. In return, the man said, I will empty my savings, every cent I have to my name. I will pay off your father's promissory note today, and your sister moves out here. Clean air, good food, away from the damp. Abby stared at him. She was calculating. He was a foreman, or maybe a small claim holder on the edge of the Montgomery spread. He lived in a shack. He was offering his life savings, everything he had sweated for just to keep this piece of dirt out of the judge's hands. He was desperate, just like her. You would give up all your money, Abby said. For this land, a man's land is all he is, he replied. Do we have a deal? It was madness. It was a trade, flesh for paper, her freedom for her sister's breath. Abby didn't hesitate. Yes. Good. My name is Arthur, he said. We go to town. Now. They walked back to Dry Creek. The mud was worse going east. Neither of them spoke. They went straight to the bank. Arthur walked in, covered in dust and sweat. He withdrew a heavy canvas bag of coins and banknotes. He handed it straight to Judge Thorne's clerk. The clerk looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. He stamped the promissory note. Pet in full. Abby put the paper in her pocket. It felt lighter than air. Then they went to the church. Reverend Miller was sweeping the front steps. He looked at the two of them, wet, muddy, exhausted. We need a piece of paper, Reverend, Arthur said. Marriage certificate. The Reverend blinked. Son, marriage is a holy sacrament. It requires counseling. Banns to be read. I have $10 for the church roof fund, Arthur said. 10 minutes later, they stood in the quiet, dim nave of the church. The air smelled of old wax and pine. Abby stood beside a man she had met 2 hours ago. Do you, Abigail Preston? Take this man. Abby looked straight ahead. I do. Do you, Arthur? Take this woman. Arthur didn't hesitate. I do. They signed the book. The ink scratched loud in the empty church. No rings, no kiss, just a stroke of a pen. Abby walked out of the church. The rain had stopped completely. The sky was breaking open, bleeding orange and purple over the western horizon. She was a married woman. She had traded her life away to a stranger in a shack. But Sarah was safe. That was all that mattered. Arthur pulled a wagon up to the church steps. It was a sturdy thing, pulled by 2 massive roan horses. Get your sister, Arthur said. We're going home. The wagon ride took an hour. Sarah was bundled in 3 heavy blankets in the back. She was coughing less. Even just being out of the damp town seemed to help her lungs. Abby sat on the wooden bench next to Arthur. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She looked straight ahead. She was preparing herself, preparing for the shack, for a drafty roof, for nights sleeping on a hard floor. She could handle it. She had handled worse. The wagon rolled over the muddy road. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised plums. They passed the spot where she had met Arthur. They passed the broken fence. They passed the sagging wooden shack. Abby frowned. "Wait," she said. "You passed your house." Arthur didn't pull back on the reins. He kept his eyes on the road. "That's not my house. That's an old line shack. We use it for storing feed during the winter." Abby felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Then where are we going?" "Home," he said simply. The wagon crested a low hill. Abby stopped breathing. Below them, nestled in a massive valley, was an estate. It wasn't a farm. It was a kingdom. There were a dozen massive barns painted stark white. There were corrals stretching for acres, filled with hundreds of horses. And in the center, sitting at the end of a long oak-lined driveway, was the main house. It was 3 stories of cut stone and dark timber, a wraparound porch, lit lanterns hanging from iron hooks. It looked like a castle dropped into the middle of the Texas dirt. At the entrance to the driveway, there were towering cast iron gates. Wrought into the metal at the top was a massive letter, M. Montgomery. Arthur drove the wagon straight through the gates. Ranch hands were walking back from the barns. They saw the wagon. They stopped. Every single one of them pulled off their hats. "Evening, boss," one of them called out. "Evening, Mr. Montgomery," said another. Arthur just nodded to them. The cold knot in Abby's stomach turned to hot lead. She turned to look at the man sitting next to her. The man in the faded, sweat-stained shirt. The man she had just sworn her life to. He wasn't the foreman. He wasn't a desperate man fighting for a scrap of land. He was Arthur Montgomery, the richest man in the state of Texas. Arthur pulled the wagon up to the front steps of the massive house. 2 servants, in pressed clothes, hurried out the front doors to take the horses. Arthur stepped down from the wagon. He reached up to offer Abby a hand. Abby didn't take it. She climbed down on her own. Her boots hit the crushed gravel. She stood rigid. Her chest was rising and falling fast. "We'll get your sister upstairs," Arthur said quietly, motioning to the servants. "There's a room prepared. South-facing. Good light. Dry." Abby didn't look at the house. She didn't look at the servants. She looked at Arthur. Her eyes were burning. "Inside," Abby said. It wasn't a request. Arthur nodded. He instructed the men to help Sarah inside gently. Then, he followed Abby through the heavy oak doors into the grand foyer. The foyer was massive, polished wood floors, a crystal chandelier overhead. It was a room designed to make a person feel small. Abby didn't feel small. She felt furious. Arthur closed the doors behind them. The click echoed in the large, empty room. He turned to face her. He took off his hat. "Abby, I can explain." "You lied to me," Abby said. Her voice wasn't a yell. It was dangerously quiet. "I omitted the scale of my wealth," Arthur corrected calmly. "The terms of our contract remain exactly the same. Your debt is paid. Your sister has a home. I have a wife to block Thorne's legal maneuver." "You omitted the truth," Abby snapped, stepping toward him. "You let me stand in the mud and beg a stranger for wages. You let me believe I was making a deal with a man as desperate as I was, a man who was sacrificing his last dollar." "Would you have agreed if you knew who I was?" Arthur asked. His blue eyes were piercing. "Would you have married Arthur Montgomery, the millionaire? Or would your pride have sent you back to town to watch your sister die?" Abby flinched. The truth of his words stung, but it didn't quench the anger. It fueled it. She stood up taller. She didn't care about the crystal chandelier. She didn't care about his money. That is not the point, Abby said, her voice ringing out, filling the grand hall. Every word was sharp. Every word was deliberate. Listen to me clearly, Mr. Montgomery, she said, holding his gaze without a blink. Do you think money gives you the right to play God with my freedom? Arthur stood perfectly still. No one had ever spoken to him like this in his own home. Mutual respect must be built on the truth, Abby continued, her voice vibrating with conviction. You look at me and you see a poor widow. You think you bought me today. You think your money gives you a pass on basic human decency. But you are wrong. She took a step closer. She pointed a finger at his chest. Inequality isn't about you being wealthy and me being poor. It is not about the size of your house or the mud on my boots. Inequality is about power. It is about you stripping away my right to know the truth before making a life-altering choice. You took away my agency. You took away my right to choose my own fate with open eyes. You treated me like a piece of livestock you bought at a blind auction, and no amount of silver in your mines gives you the right to do that to another human being. Silence crashed down on the foyer. Arthur looked down at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw a woman who had nothing, absolutely nothing, yet refused to bow to a man who had everything. He had expected her to be grateful. He had expected her to be awed by the house. He had expected her to be a quiet, compliant tool for his legal war. He had miscalculated badly. Arthur let out a slow breath. The tension in his broad shoulders dropped a fraction. You are right, Arthur said. Abby blinked. She had braced herself for an argument, for arrogance. I was wrong, Arthur continued. His voice was no longer the cold, commanding tone of a boss. It was the tired voice of a man carrying too many ghosts. I lied, and I stripped you of your choice. He walked over to a heavy wooden side table and leaned against it. He looked suddenly older. 5 years ago, Arthur said, staring at the floor. I was married, Beatrice. She didn't care about the land. She cared about the name, the money. When a drought hit, and the herds died, and the money dried up for a season, she left. She packed her bags in the middle of a storm and went back east. She took half of what I had left. He looked back up at Abby. When I saw you today, I didn't see a woman trying to save her sister. I saw a stranger. I saw someone who might run to Thorn the minute she realized how much I had to lose. I hid who I was because I don't trust anyone who knows what my name is worth. Abby listened. Her anger didn't vanish, but it cooled. She recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of a wounded animal biting anything that came near it. Your past is your own, Mr. Montgomery, Abby said softly, but firmly. But I am not your ex-wife. I am Abigail Preston. I pay my debts, and I keep my word. Arthur nodded slowly. I see that now. We have a contract? Abby said, straightening her posture. 2 years. I will stay. I will play the part. I will smile for the judge and his spies. But we are going to set rules. Name them, Arthur said. We live under the same roof, Abby said, but we live separate lives. You don't question my movements. I don't question yours. I want a room near my sister, and I want real work. I won't sit in a parlor and sip tea while your men break their backs. I need to earn my keep. Arthur looked at her. A faint, almost invisible smile touched the corner of his mouth. Agreed, he said. Your sister is in the south wing. Choose any room next to hers. The staff will answer to you. Abby nodded once. Crisp. Professional. She turned and walked toward the grand staircase. Her muddy boots left faint marks on the polished wood floor. She didn't look back. Arthur Montgomery stood alone in the grand foyer. He listened to her footsteps fade on the stairs. He had bought a wife to save his land, but as he looked at the mud on his floor, he realized he had brought something entirely different into his home. He had brought in a storm, and for the first time in 5 years, the massive, empty house didn't feel like a tomb. 3 weeks passed. Abby didn't sit in the parlor. She didn't pour tea. She didn't wear silk dresses. She wore a heavy canvas skirt and a plain cotton blouse. She woke up at dawn. She went down to the kitchens and helped the cook knead bread. Then she went to the stables. She mucked out the stalls. She brushed down the horses. The ranch hands stared at first. They whispered, "A millionaire's wife, shoveling manure." It didn't make sense, but out west respect isn't given to a name, it's given to sweat. By the end of the second week, the whispering stopped. The men started tipping their hats to her, not because she was the boss wife, but because she worked just as hard as they did. Arthur watched her. He didn't interfere. He let her carve out her own space on the ranch. They lived in the same house. They ate at the same long dining table. But they kept a polite, quiet distance. Then, the outside world came knocking. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The air was dry and hot. A sleek black buggy rolled up the long oak driveway. It didn't belong to a rancher. It belonged to a politician. Arthur was on the front porch. He was going over a ledger. He closed the book slowly. He stood up. Abby was coming around the side of the house. She had a basket of fresh eggs on her hip. She saw the buggy. She saw the man stepping out of it. Judge Silas Thorne. He was a large man, dressed in a tailored gray suit. A gold watch chain hung across his broad chest. Right behind him was Higgins, the rat-faced lawyer from town. Abby handed the egg basket to a passing ranch hand. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked straight up the porch steps and stood right next to Arthur. They didn't look at each other, but their shoulders were inches apart, a united front. "Mr. Montgomery," Judge Thorne said. His voice was smooth, like oiled leather. He took off his hat. He smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And the new Mrs. Montgomery. What a delightful surprise this marriage was to the whole county. "Judge," Arthur said. His voice was flat. "To what do I owe the visit?" "Just a neighborly call," Thorne said. He stepped up onto the porch. He looked around. He looked at the vast rolling hills of the Montgomery estate. He looked hungry. "I wanted to offer my congratulations and my condolences. The passing of your father, Abigail, was a tragedy. I was glad to hear his debts were suddenly cleared." "My husband is a generous man," Abby said. Her voice was steady, ice cold. Thorne's eyes flicked to her. "Indeed, very generous, and very fast. A sudden courtship, a sudden wedding, right before the new property laws take effect. It's almost a miracle." "Miracles happen, Judge," Arthur said. Thorne chuckled softly. "They do. But I am a man of the law, Arthur. Believe in facts, not miracles. The county requires certain verifications to ensure that land titles are held by legitimate, cohabitating couples, not just names on a hasty piece of paper." It was a threat, wrapped in a polite smile. "You can verify whatever you like, Silas," Arthur said. He stepped closer to the edge of the porch. "But you step foot on my land uninvited again, and I won't have a conversation with you. I'll have a conversation with my rifle. Have a good afternoon." Thorne's smile vanished. The mask slipped, just for a second. He nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. "Good day, Mr. Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery." Thorne and Higgins got back in the buggy. They drove away. The dust settled on the driveway. Arthur looked at Abby. He's not going to stop. He's going to dig. He's going to look for any crack in this marriage to tear it apart. "Let him dig," Abby said. "He won't find anything, but the past has a funny way of catching up with you." 2 days later, a different kind of visitor arrived. It was late afternoon. Arthur was in his ground floor study, the window open to catch the breeze. Abby was sitting on the porch, mending a torn bridle. A lone rider came up the drive. He didn't have a buggy. He rode a tired, dust-covered roan. He wore a faded blue coat with brass buttons, a Union cavalry jacket. He looked exhausted. He tied his horse to the hitching post and walked up the steps. Abby looked up. The bridle slipped from her hands. The man stopped. He stared at her. He took off his dusty hat. "Good God," the man whispered. "Nurse Preston?" Abby stood up. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them against her skirt to steady them. "Captain Vance." Arthur was sitting inside the study. He heard the name. He stopped writing. He listened. Captain Elias Vance smiled. It was a tired, broken smile. "I didn't think I'd ever find you. I've been riding across Texas for 3 months, checking every town record." "What are you doing here, Elias?" Abby asked softly. "I need your signature, Abby," Vance said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. "We're petitioning Congress for the nurses. The ones who didn't have official commissions. The ones who bled and starved right alongside us. We're trying to get them veteran pensions." Abby shook her head. "I wasn't commissioned. I was just a volunteer." "They won't care about my name. They will care about what you did," Vance said. His voice cracked. He stepped closer. "Abby, you were at Antietam. You were at Gettysburg. When the surgeons ran out of ether, you stayed. When the doctors collapsed from exhaustion, you picked up the scalpel. You took off my left leg below the knee. You saved my life. You saved 200 men in my regiment alone." Inside the study, Arthur went entirely still. A surgical nurse, amputations. He had thought she was just a poor girl from town, a girl who had lived a quiet, desperate life. He had no idea. "I don't want a pension, Elias," Abby said quietly. She looked away. She looked at the rolling hills. "I left the war behind. I want it to stay there." "Please, Abby," Vance pleaded. "If you sign, it proves we had capable women doing the work of surgeons. It paves the way for others." Abby stood silent for a long time. The wind rustled the oak trees. Finally, she reached out. She took the pen. She signed her name on the ledger. Abigail Preston. Vance thanked her. He tipped his hat. He got back on his horse and rode away. Abby stood on the porch for a long time. That night, the house was quiet. Sarah was asleep upstairs. Abby was in the kitchen, boiling water for tea. Arthur walked in. He didn't go to the icebox. He didn't pour a drink. He just stood in the doorway. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Abby didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the stove. "Tell you what, that you were a field surgeon, that you saved hundreds of men." Arthur walked into the room. "You told me you could stitch a wound. You didn't tell me you walked through hell and carried men out of it." Abby took the kettle off the heat. She turned to face him. Her dark eyes were intense in the dim lantern light. "Because it wasn't a selling point, Arthur," Abby said. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it. "Because society deems a woman holding a scalpel to be a grotesque anomaly." Arthur frowned. "That's foolishness. You saved lives." "It doesn't matter to the world," Abby said, stepping forward. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her face. "They see a woman with blood on her hands, and they call her unnatural. They lock the doors of the medical colleges. They tell us our minds are too fragile for science, and our stomachs too weak for surgery." She stopped a few feet from him. She looked him dead in the eye. "But I believe knowledge has no gender," Abby declared. Her words filled the kitchen. They weren't just words. They were a manifesto. The ability to save. A life doesn't depend on being a man or a woman. It depends on nerve. It depends on compassion. The right to medical education and practice belongs to anyone brave enough to face death. I kept it quiet because I was tired of fighting men who think a woman's only place is in a parlor. I didn't want to fight you, too." Arthur stared at her. He didn't argue. He couldn't. He looked at her hands, the small, calloused hands that had sawed through bone to save a man's life. He felt a sudden, profound wave of respect. It hit him harder than a physical blow. He didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly. He turned and walked out of the kitchen. Abby watched him go. She poured her tea. 4 days later, a package arrived on the morning train from Boston. Abby found it sitting on her bed. It was a heavy wooden box. Polished mahogany, brass hinges. She opened it. Inside, resting on dark blue velvet, was a complete surgical kit. Scalpels of the finest steel, bone saws, hemostats, silk sutures, a stethoscope. It was the kind of kit a chief surgeon at a city hospital would use. There was no note, there was no card, just the tools. Abby touched the cold steel of a scalpel. Her throat tightened. Arthur hadn't bought her a dress. He hadn't bought her jewelry. He had bought her recognition. He had seen exactly who she was. And he hadn't asked her to hide it. The air in Texas can turn on a dime. 1 minute, the sky is a hard, brilliant blue. The next, the horizon turns the color of a bruised plum. The wind stops dead. The birds stop singing. The silence gets so heavy it presses against your eardrums. That's how it started on a Thursday evening. Abby was on the front porch, watching the sky. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 5 minutes. The air smelled like ozone and wet dust. A Gulf storm was coming, and it was coming fast. Arthur came out the front door. He had a heavy oilskin coat over his arm. His face was grim. "It's a bad one," he said. He looked at the black clouds rolling over the hills. The barometer in the study just dropped off the cliff. "We need to secure the animals." "I'll help," Abby said. "Stay inside," Arthur ordered. It wasn't a request. It was instinct. "Keep Sarah calm. The wind is going to tear the shingles off the roof." He didn't wait for an answer. He threw on his coat and ran toward the main barns. Abby watched him go. The first drop of rain hit the porch. It was the size of a silver dollar. Then the sky ripped open. The rain didn't fall. It fired sideways. The wind howled, a deafening roar that shook the heavy timbers of the house. Lightning flashed, turning the yard into a stark, blinding white for a split second. Crack. Thunder shook the ground. Abby went inside. She checked on Sarah. The girl was sitting up in bed, looking out the window with wide eyes. "I'm fine, Abby," Sarah said over the roar of the rain. "Go." Sarah knew her sister. She knew Abby couldn't sit in a safe room while there was work to be done in the dark. Abby grabbed her canvas coat. She pulled it tight. She tied a scarf over her hair. She ran out the back door and plunged into the storm. It was like running through a waterfall. The mud instantly swallowed her boots. The wind pushed against her chest, trying to knock her flat. She kept her head down and fought her way toward the north barn. That was where they kept the prized breeding horses. She saw lanterns swinging wildly through the sheets of rain. Men were shouting, but the wind stole their voices. Abby reached the barn doors. She pushed inside. It was chaos. The wind had caught the edge of the roof. The heavy wooden beams up top were groaning. Dust and hay were swirling in the air. The horses were terrified. They were rearing in their stalls, kicking at the wood, screaming in panic. Arthur was in the middle of it. He was covered in mud. He was trying to get a halter on a massive black stallion. The horse was wild with fear. It reared up, its hooves slashing the air inches from Arthur's head. "We have to get them out," Arthur yelled to his men. "Move them to the stone corral. The roof is going to give." He didn't see Abby until she was right next to him. "Hold his head," Abby shouted. Arthur blinked in surprise, but he didn't argue. He threw his weight against the horse's neck. Abby stepped in. She didn't flinch. She grabbed the horse's mane, spoke a sharp, commanding word, and slipped the halter over its ears in one fluid motion. "Go!" she yelled. Arthur dragged the stallion out into the rain. Abby ran to the next stall. For an hour, it was nothing but muscle, mud, and adrenaline. Abby fought alongside the ranch hands. She pulled frightened animals through the driving rain. Her coat was soaked through. Her hands were blistered from the rough rope. But she didn't stop. Every time Arthur looked back, she was there, pulling her weight, fighting the storm. They got the last mare out, just as a massive crack of lightning hit the ridge. The sound was deafening. A second later, the main support beam of the north barn snapped like a twig. "Get back!" Arthur roared. He lunged forward, grabbing Abby around the waist. He tackled her out the side door just as the roof caved in. Wood splintered. Shingles flew like shrapnel. A cloud of wet dust exploded outward. They hit the mud hard. Arthur took the brunt of the fall, shielding her with his body. They lay there for a second. The rain pounded down on them. The barn beside them was a ruined pile of timber. But the horses were safe. Arthur rolled off her. He was breathing hard. "Are you hurt?" Abby sat up. She wiped the mud from her eyes. "No, I'm fine." She looked at him. Arthur was holding his right hand against his chest. Blood was washing down his wrist, mixing with the rain. A piece of splintered wood had caught him across the palm. It was a deep, ugly gash. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's just a scratch," Arthur said, wincing. "Don't be stupid," Abby said. She grabbed his uninjured arm and pulled him up. "The tack room is still standing. Come on." At the back of the ruined barn, the small stone tack room had survived. They pushed the heavy oak door open and stumbled inside. It was dark, dry. It smelled of old leather and saddle soap. The roar of the storm was muffled behind the thick stone walls. Abby found a lantern on a hook. She struck a match and lit it. The yellow glow pushed back the shadows. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to a wooden crate. Arthur sat. He was shivering slightly. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the cold. Abby didn't hesitate. She knelt in front of him. She pulled the heavy medical kit from her deep coat pocket. She had brought it with her just in case. She opened the polished wooden box. She took his injured hand. Her touch was gentle, but entirely professional. She cleaned the wound with iodine. Arthur hissed through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. "It needs stitches," Abby said. She threaded a needle with silk. She worked quickly, precisely. Arthur watched her. He watched the steady rhythm of her hands. Hands that had held together broken men in the middle of a war. Now they were fixing him. The silence in the stone room was heavy. Outside, the wind screamed. "Beatrice hated the rain," Arthur said, suddenly. His voice was quiet. It barely carried over the storm. Abby paused for a fraction of a second, then continued stitching. She didn't look up. She just listened. "We had a storm like this," Arthur continued, staring at the lantern light. 5 years ago, we lost a herd. We lost 2 barns. I was out there in the mud for 2 days trying to save what I could." He swallowed hard. "When I came back into the house," he said softly, "she was gone. She took a train east. She left a note on the table. It said she couldn't stand the dirt. She couldn't stand the unpredictability. She wanted a gentleman in a parlor, not a farmer in the mud." Abby tied off the first stitch. She snipped the silk. "I swore I would never let anyone close enough to walk away again," Arthur whispered. "I built a wall around this ranch. I built a wall around myself. I turned everything into a contract, because a contract can't betray you. Only people can." He looked down at her. His pale blue eyes were stripped bare. The billionaire, the boss, all of it was gone. He was just a man who was terrified of the storm inside his own head. Abby tied off the final stitch. She wrapped his hand in a clean white bandage. She didn't let go of his hand. She looked up. She met his eyes. "Arthur," Abby said. Her voice was soft, but it carried an undeniable weight. She held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. She needed him to hear this. Not just hear it. Understand it. You cannot use the sins of your past to punish yourself and those who come after, Abby told him. The words were deliberate, clear. Beatrice made her choice, but you are making one too. You think pushing people away makes you strong. She gently squeezed his bandaged hand. Healing isn't building a wall so high that no one can hurt you anymore, Abby declared. That isn't safety. That is a prison, and you are the warden and the prisoner. Arthur stared at her. His chest rose and fell heavily. Healing is a choice, Abby continued, her voice ringing with the hard-earned truth of a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to live. Healing is allowing yourself to trust in human decency again, even knowing you might bleed. It is standing in the rain with someone and believing they won't leave when the roof caves in. She let go of his hand. She packed her instruments back into the polished wooden box. "I didn't leave, Arthur," she said quietly. "I'm right here in the mud with you." She closed the box. The click of the brass latch echoed in the small room. Arthur looked at his bandaged hand. Then he looked at Abby, the mud on her face, the rain in her dark hair. For the first time in 5 years, the wall around his heart cracked, not from a blow, but from the simple, terrifying realization that he didn't want to be alone behind it anymore. The morning after the storms was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. The air was washed clean. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. The ruined north barn sat in a pile of splintered wood, but the horses were grazing in the stone corral. They were safe. Arthur walked out onto the porch. His right hand was wrapped in clean white cotton. He looked out over the land. Then he looked back at the house. He and Abby hadn't spoken about the tack room. They hadn't spoken about the stitches, or the wall, or Beatrice. But something had shifted. The ice in the house had thawed. They passed each other in the hall and nodded. The nods weren't stiff anymore. They were real. It was a fragile peace, and Judge Silas Thorne knew exactly how to break it. It happened at noon. The sun was high and hot. Abby was in the kitchen, helping the cook peel potatoes. Sarah was resting on the porch with a book. A heavy wagon rolled up the drive. Not a buggy, a county wagon. Abby wiped her hands on a towel. She walked out to the porch. Arthur was already there. He was standing at the top of the steps. His jaw was tight. Higgins climbed down from the wagon. The rat-faced lawyer was smiling. It was a terrible, thin smile. Right behind him was Sheriff Miller. The sheriff looked down at his boots. He didn't want to be there. "Sheriff," Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble. "Higgins, you're trespassing." "Not today, Mr. Montgomery," Higgins said. He pulled a thick, folded piece of parchment from his coat pocket. "Today, we are executing an order of the county court." Abby stepped up beside Arthur. "What order?" Higgins looked at her. His eyes were bright with malice. "An order of eviction, Miss Preston, and a summons for fraud." Arthur went perfectly still. "Watch your mouth, Higgins. That is my wife." "No, sir." "She isn't," Higgins said. He snapped the paper open. The sound cracked like a whip in the dry air. "According to the investigator the judge hired, this woman is a bigamist." The word hung in the air. Heavy. Ugly. Abby felt the blood drain from her face. "You see," Higgins continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "we looked into the late Mr. Preston's debts, and we looked into his daughter. We found a marriage certificate 5 years ago to a Mr. Jeremiah Preston. Abby closed her eyes. Jeremiah. The name tasted like ash. He died, Abby said. Her voice was barely a whisper. He left 3 years ago. He was killed out in the territory. Do you have a death certificate? Higgins asked. He tilted his head. Abby swallowed hard. No, but word came back. Word came back, Higgins interrupted, laughing softly. Hearsay, Miss Preston. Without a legal death certificate, Jeremiah Preston is recognized by the state of Texas as alive and well, which means your marriage to Mr. Montgomery here is null. Void. A complete fabrication. He turned to Arthur. The Single-Owner Land Seizure Act applies, Mr. Montgomery. You are an unmarried man. You hold excessive, unproductive borderlands. The county is seizing the Western Ridge. You have 48 hours to vacate the lower pastures. Higgins handed the paper to the sheriff. The sheriff walked up the steps, his eyes full of apology, and handed it to Arthur. I'm sorry, Arthur, the sheriff muttered. Judge's orders. They got back in the wagon. They drove away. The silence that followed was deafening. Abby stood on the porch. She couldn't feel her hands. Jeremiah, the man who had used his fists on her until she learned how to stitch her own split lip. She had buried his memory. Now, his ghost was tearing down the only safe place she had left. She turned to Arthur. Arthur, I didn't know, I swear to you. I thought he was dead. Arthur was staring at the paper. His knuckles were white. The bandage on his hand was stained with dirt. He didn't look at her. He looked at the paper. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't sound like him. It was hollow, cold, like a winter wind coming off the plains. You didn't know, Arthur repeated. I didn't, Abby said, taking a step toward him. He ran out on my father and me. A man from New Mexico came through a year later. Said Jeremiah was shot in a card game. There was no body, no paper. But he never came back. Arthur finally looked up. His pale blue eyes were empty. The wall he had let crack in the tack room had slammed back into place. Thicker, higher, made of iron. You knew the terms of our contract, Arthur said. You agreed to bring no legal complications to this ranch. You knew my entire estate was riding on the legality of our marriage. I thought I was a widow, Abby pleaded. You thought, Arthur snapped. His voice rose, echoing off the stone walls of the house. The trauma of his past, the betrayal of Beatrice, was bleeding through. He wasn't seeing Abby anymore. He was seeing every lie he had ever been told. You didn't verify it. You just saw a rich man offering to pay your debts, and you took the money. You played me. Abby physically recoiled. The words hit her like a physical blow. You think I planned this? She asked. Her voice shook, not with fear, with absolute, blinding disbelief. I think you got exactly what you wanted, Arthur said bitterly. Your father's debt is paid. Your sister is safe. And now I lose 20,000 acres because I was fool enough to trust a stranger I found in the mud. Abby stared at him. The silence stretched. It pulled tight. It snapped. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. The shock melted away, leaving behind a cold, hard core of pride. She stood up completely straight. She looked the wealthiest man in Texas dead in the eye. I told you the truth in that tack room, Abby said. Her voice was steady. It didn't waver a fraction of an inch. I told you I was in the mud with you. But you are so terrified of being hurt that you would rather believe I am a monster than believe I made a mistake. Arthur opened his mouth, but Abby cut him off. Listen to me, Arthur Montgomery, she said. Her words were sharp and deliberate. My dignity is not something you can weigh on a scale against your acres. You bought my debt. You did not buy my conscience. And you certainly did not buy the right to speak to me like a common thief. She took a step closer. I would rather walk away with absolutely nothing than stay in a house where my humanity is not respected, she declared. You want to be alone behind your walls? Fine. Be alone. Abby turned on her heel. She walked into the house. She went upstairs. She packed her canvas bag. She woke Sarah. She wrapped her sister in a heavy shawl. 10 minutes later, she walked back down the stairs. Arthur was still standing in the foyer. He watched her, his jaw clenched, but he didn't say a word. Abby didn't look at him. She led Sarah out the front door. They didn't take a wagon. They walked. Down the oak-lined drive, past the pristine white barns. They walked until they reached the old, dilapidated tenant shack on the edge of the property, the one with the sagging roof. Abby pushed the door open. It was dusty. Cold. She set her bag down. She made a bed for Sarah out of an old blanket. She had nothing. Again, but as she looked out the cracked window toward the massive stone mansion on the hill, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to wait to be saved. Not by Arthur. Not by anyone. She was going to fix this herself. The tenant shack was freezing at night. Abby didn't sleep. She sat by the small, smoking hearth. She watched the embers glow. She needed a death certificate. She needed proof from New Mexico. That meant she needed a private investigator, and that meant she needed money. She reached under her collar. She pulled out a thin silver chain. At the end of it was a small, tarnished silver locket. It had belonged to her mother. It was the only thing of value she hadn't sold to pay the town doctor. Abby held it in her hand. It felt warm. When the sun came up, she didn't walk up to the main house. She walked the 5 miles back to Dry Creek. She went to the telegraph office. The telegraph operator, an old man named Miller, looked at her in surprise. Everyone in town knew the Montgomerys had kicked her out of the big house. "I need to send a wire," Abby said, "to the marshal in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I need a reply paid for." Miller adjusted his spectacles. "That's an expensive wire, Mrs. Montgomery." "Preston," Abby corrected. She placed the silver locket on the counter. "Will this cover it? And a few more if he needs to wire a clerk in the territories?" Miller looked at the locket. He looked at Abby S.I.'s. He nodded slowly. "It'll cover it." She sent the wire. Name: Jeremiah Preston. Last seen: 1873. Cause of death: gunshot. Requesting official county record of death to be wired to the Dry Creek telegraph office. Then she waited. She walked back to the shack. She chopped her own wood. She boiled her own water. 2 days passed. Arthur didn't come. She didn't expect him to. On the morning of the 3rd day, a boy from town rode up to the shack on a mule. He held a yellow piece of paper. Abby took it. Her hands were steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. She unfolded it. Requiem. Stop. Preston, Jeremiah. To see Dr. 14, 1873. Stop. Killed in dispus over cards. Stop. Buried in Potters and 5. Stop. Official seal and record. Copied and wired by order of territorial marshal. Abby let out a breath. It was a long, shaky breath. She had it. The proof. She wasn't a bigamist. The marriage to Arthur was legal. The land was safe. She looked up at the big stone house on the hill. All she had to do was walk up there. Hand Arthur the paper. He would apologize. He would take her back. The contract would be fulfilled. Abby folded the paper. She put it in her pocket. She didn't walk up the hill. Arthur had shown her exactly who he was when things got hard. He didn't trust her. He trusted paper. Fine. He could have his paper when they got to court in Austin. Right now, Abby had a bigger problem. Judge Thorne. Even with the death certificate, Thorne was a snake. He would stall. He would claim the wire was forged. He would find another loophole. Beating him on a technicality wasn't enough. He had to be beaten in the light of day. He had to be exposed. Abby saddled the old gray mule the boy had left behind. She rode past the Montgomery gates, but she didn't go to town. She rode north, to the Holt Ranch. Margaret Holt was 52 years old, a widow. 5 years ago, Judge Thorne had used a fabricated tax lien to steal 3,000 acres of her best grazing land. Margaret lived in a modest farmhouse now, her wealth stripped away by the gavel. Abby tied the mule to the fence. She knocked on the door. Margaret opened it. She looked at Abby. She had heard the rumors, too. "Mrs. Holt," Abby said, "I need your help, and I need your parlor." Margaret didn't ask questions. She saw the fire in the younger woman's eyes. She opened the door wide. By mid-afternoon, there were 4 women in Margaret's parlor. Margaret Holt, Sarah Evans, the doctor's wife, Mary Gable, who ran the boarding house, where Abby and her sister had nearly starved, and Clara Higgins, the aunt of the judge's rat-faced lawyer, a woman who despised what her nephew had become. They sat on floral armchairs. They held teacups. They looked at Abby. Abby didn't sit. She stood by the fireplace. "Thank you for coming," Abby said. "I know what the town is saying about me. They say I'm a fraud. They say my marriage to Arthur Montgomery is a lie to steal his land." She reached into her pocket. She pulled out the yellow telegram. She placed it on the small wooden coffee table. "This is the official death record of my first husband," Abby said. "He died in 1873. My marriage to Arthur is completely legal. Judge Thorne knows this. He doesn't care. He is going to try to seize the Montgomery Western Ridge on Monday in the Austin courthouse," the women murmured. Margaret Holt frowned. "Silas Thorne has the courts in his pocket, Abby. Paper doesn't stop him." "You're right," Abby said. "Paper doesn't stop him. Fear keeps him in power. That if anyone speaks out, he will turn his laws against them. He did it to you, Margaret. He tried to do it to me by threatening to put my sick sister in a workhouse." Abby looked at the women. She looked at their lined faces, their calloused hands. These were women who had built Texas just as much as the men had. "I am going to court on Monday," Abby said. Her voice grew stronger. It resonated in the small room. "I am going to present this wire. But I am not just defending my marriage. I am accusing Silas Thorne of judicial tyranny." Mary Gable gasped softly. "You can't do that. He'll ruin you." "He has already tried," Abby said. She stepped away from the fireplace. She stood in the center of the room. "Listen to me," Abby urged, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "We cannot remain silent any longer. Silas Thorne's tyranny only thrives because we let fear steal our voices." She looked at Margaret. "He stole your land because you were a widow, and he thought you wouldn't fight back." She looked at Clara. "He corrupts the young men in this town because good people look the other way." Abby stood tall. Her words were a rhythmic, beating drum. "Equality before the law is not granted," Abby declared explicitly. "It must be demanded. The law is supposed to be a shield for the vulnerable, not a sword for the corrupt. It does not belong solely to wealthy men with gavels. It belongs to us." The room was perfectly quiet. The teacups were still. "We stand up today," Abby continued, her voice filled with a fierce, burning light, "not just to protect land. We stand up to fight for the right of every human being in Texas to live with their heads held high, to not be bullied, to not be treated as secondary citizens simply because we wear dresses or lack a bank account." She looked at them, one by one. "I need witnesses," Abby said. "I need women of standing in this county to travel to Austin with me, to stand in that courtroom, to tell the state magistrate exactly what Silas Thorne has been doing to the families of Dry Creek." She stopped. She waited. The silence dragged on. It was a heavy, terrifying thing. Fighting a judge in 1878 was a dangerous game. It could cost them everything they had left. Margaret Holt set her teacup down on its saucer. The porcelain clinked sharply. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her dark wool skirt. "I lost my husband to the cholera," Margaret said quietly. "I lost my land to Silas Thorne. I am tired of losing things." She looked at Abby. A slow, hard smile spread across her weathered face. "What time does the train leave for Austin?" Margaret asked. Mary Gable stood up next, then Clara. Abby looked at the three women standing with her. She didn't have Arthur's millions. She didn't have a grand stone house. But as she walked out of that parlor, she knew she had something stronger. She had a voice. And she wasn't the only one shouting anymore. The Travis County Courthouse was built of heavy limestone. It sat in the center of Austin like a fortress. Inside, the air was thick. Hot, it smelled of floor wax and old sweat. The courtroom was packed. Abby sat at the defendant S table. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. She wore her best dress, a dark navy wool, brushed clean of dust. She didn't look nervous. She looked like a soldier waiting for the artillery to stop. Arthur sat 2 feet away from her. They hadn't spoken since she left the ranch. He had sent a buggy for her that morning. She had declined it and ridden the train with Margaret Holt and the women of Dry Creek. Now they sat side by side, close enough to touch. But there was a mile of silence between them. The gavel hit the wood. It sounded like a gunshot. Judge Silas Thorne sat behind the plaintiff's table. He wasn't presiding today. A state magistrate named Caldwell was on the bench. But Thorne was running the show. Higgins stood up. He smoothed his expensive suit. He began pacing in front of the judge. "Your Honor," Higgins said, his voice slick and loud, "this is a simple case of fraud. Mr. Arthur Montgomery is an unmarried man hoarding thousands of acres of unworked land. To avoid the Single-Owner Land Seizure Act, he procured a fake marriage to a woman who is, in the eyes of the law, a bigamist," the gallery murmured. Higgins pointed a finger at Abby. "Abigail Preston is a gold digger, a woman of no standing. She abandoned her lawful husband, Jeremiah, and tricked her way into the richest home in Texas to clear her debts." Abby didn't flinch. She just stared at Higgins. Arthur S. Lawyer, an older man named Sterling, stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is relying on outdated hearsay. We have the official death record of Jeremiah Preston, wired directly from the territorial marshal in New Mexico. He died in 1873. Sterling handed the yellow telegram to the bailiff. The bailiff handed it to Magistrate Caldwell. Higgins sneered. "A wire is easily forged, Your Honor, especially when a woman has millions of acres of land to gain. She is a stranger to this county. She has no ties, no morals. She is an opportunist." "That is a lie." The voice didn't come from the lawyers' tables. It came from the gallery. Margaret Holt stood up. She was wearing her Sunday black. She looked small in the massive room, but her voice carried all the way to the vaulted ceiling. "Order," Magistrate Caldwell shouted. "No, sir, I will not have order while that man lies," Margaret said. She walked down the center aisle, right past the wooden railing. Mary Gable and Clara Higgins stood up and followed her. Thorne's face turned bright red. "Your Honor, remove these women." Margaret ignored him. She looked directly at the magistrate. "My name is Margaret Holt. Silas Thorne used the law to steal my farm 5 years ago. He told me I was a weak widow. He told me nobody would listen to a woman without a bank account. He is trying to do the exact same thing to Arthur Montgomery. And he is trying to destroy Abigail Preston because she was brave enough to stand in his way." The courtroom went dead silent. Abby looked at Margaret. Her throat tightened. She had asked them to come. But seeing them actually stand up to the most dangerous man in their county, it was breathtaking. "Abigail Preston is no stranger," Margaret declared. pointing at Abby. She has stitched up our children. She has worked the mud alongside the ranch hands. She is more a part of Texas than Silas Thorne will ever be. The magistrate rubbed his temples. Mrs. Holt, this is highly irregular. Take your seat. But the damage to Thorne's narrative was done. The crowd was whispering. They were looking at Thorne with hard, questioning eyes. Higgins was panicking. He slammed his hand on the table. This is a circus, Your Honor. The point remains. This marriage is a sham. A business transaction between a millionaire and a desperate beggar. They have no history, no connection. It is a fraud against the state. Arthur stood up. He didn't look at his lawyer. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Higgins. Sit down, Arthur, Sterling whispered. Arthur ignored him. He reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a thick, yellowed envelope. He walked past his lawyer. He laid the envelope on the Judge S. bench. Mr. Montgomery, Caldwell said, frowning. What is this? It is a charter. Your Honor, Arthur said. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the room hold its breath from 20 years ago, the year 1858. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. My father, William Montgomery, founded an educational trust for Travis County. Arthur explained, turning to face the courtroom. He wanted to build a school for the children of tenant farmers. But he couldn't fund it alone. He needed a partner. Arthur turned slowly. He looked at Abby. His pale blue eyes were entirely clear. The walls were gone. I always knew about the trust, Arthur said softly, speaking more to her than to the judge. But I never knew the name of the man who co-founded it. Not until my lawyer pulled the original charter yesterday. Arthur turned back to the judge. The co-founder of that trust, Arthur stated, his voice ringing out, was William Preston, Abigail Est's father. Abby gasped softly. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her father, the quiet, broken man who had died in debt. He had built a legacy she never knew about. My father and her father built the foundation of this county together, Arthur continued. They poured their money into the future, into the children. Abigail and I are not strangers. Our families have been bound together by a shared belief in this land for 2 decades. This marriage is not a fraud. It is destiny. Higgins stammered. Your Honor, this proves nothing about her character. She is still a woman who sells herself for a debt. Arthur turned on Higgins. His eyes burned with sudden, fierce anger. You will not speak of my wife that way, Arthur commanded. He stepped to the center of the floor. He looked at the magistrate. He looked at the gallery. Then he looked directly at Silas Thorne. It was time to speak the truth. Not just for Abby, but for every person in the room. Your Honor, Arthur began, his voice steady and resolute. For too long, men in power have decided the worth of the people beneath them. We sit in courtrooms and judge the value of a human life based on pieces of paper and bank ledgers. He gestured toward Abby. Mr. Higgins claims my wife has no standing because she is a woman, because she is a widow, because she was a victim of a cruel man. Let me be absolutely clear. A woman's value is not appraised by the balance of her husband's bank account. Her dignity is not diminished by a past where she was a victim. The courtroom was completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. Abigail Preston stood on the battlefields of the Civil War, Arthur continued explicitly, ensuring every word landed. She used her own hands to save the lives of hundreds of dying men. She works the land. She fights for the weak. Her existence is a testament to the greatest compassion humanity has to offer. He took a step closer to the judge's bench. Equality is not a privilege we hand out when it is convenient. It is an absolute right. The right to be judged by your character, not your sex. The right to be safe from men like Silas Thorne, who weaponized the law to steal from widows and the sick. Arthur turned fully to look at Abby. "I stand here today," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a softer, but no less powerful register, not as her savior, but as a man who is humbled by her strength. Being her husband is not a business transaction. It is the greatest privilege of my life. Abby felt the tears spill over her eyelashes. She didn't wipe them away. Magistrate Caldwell looked at the charter. He looked at the telegram. He looked at Silas Thorne, whose face was pale and sweating. The magistrate picked up his gavel. "The death certificate is recognized by this court," Caldwell declared. "The marriage is valid. The Single-Owner Land Seizure Act does not apply. Case dismissed. And Judge Thorne, I suggest you retain counsel. The state will be looking into Mrs. Holt's allegations." The gavel slammed down. The courtroom erupted into cheers. Margaret Holt hugged Mary Gable. Higgins practically ran for the back doors. Thorne sat frozen at his table, a broken man. Arthur didn't celebrate. He just walked straight toward Abby. She stood up. The table was between them. "Walk with me," Arthur said. They walked out of the courtroom together, out the heavy brass doors, out onto the wide limestone steps of the courthouse. The Austin sun was bright, beating down on the city. They stopped at the bottom of the steps. The crowds were still inside. They were alone. Arthur took off his hat. He held it in his hands. He looked nervous. The billionaire rancher looked terrified. "I was wrong," Arthur said. "No excuses. No qualifications. When the investigator brought that paper, I let my past blind me. I built a wall to keep myself safe, and I used it to crush the only real thing I had. You told me the truth. You stood in the mud with me, and I left you out in the cold." Abby looked at him. "You hurt me, Arthur." "I know," he said, his voice cracked, "and I don't expect you to forgive me today. Our contract was for 2 years. You've won. Your debt is gone. Your sister is well. I will give you half of everything I own right now. You can take Sarah and go anywhere in the world. You never have to see me again." He looked down at his hat. "But I am asking you not to." Abby watched him. She saw the vulnerability, the absolute surrender. "I don't want half your money, Arthur," Abby said. Arthur looked up. His eyes were desperate. "Then what do you want?" Abby took a step up. She stood on the same step as him. She reached out and took his hand, the hand with the fading scar across the palm. "I want the man who sat in the tack room," Abby said softly. "The man who listened. I want a partner, not a boss, not a landlord. I want to know that when the storm comes, we hold the roof up together." Arthur squeezed her hand. "I swear it, Abby, on my life, on my father's name." Abby smiled. It was a real smile. It reached her eyes and banished the shadows that had lived there for years. "Then I guess we better go home," she said. "We have a ranch to run." 6 months later, the Texas morning broke like a cracked egg, spilling gold and orange light over the eastern hills. The Montgomery ranch was alive. But it wasn't the usual sound of spurs and cattle. Today, it was the sound of fiddles tuning up, the smell of roasting beef over open hickory pits. Abby stood in front of the tall mirror in her bedroom. She wasn't wearing navy wool or heavy canvas. She wore a dress of ivory silk. It was simple. No heavy lace, no corset pulling her ribs tight. Just clean, flowing lines that let her breathe. Sarah stood behind her, adjusting the veil. Sarah looked entirely different. The hollows in her cheeks were gone. Her skin was flushed with color. The dry air and good food had done their work. She was vibrant, alive. "You look beautiful, Abby," Sarah whispered, her eyes shining in the mirror. "I look like a woman who is about to be late to her own wedding." Abby laughed softly. "It's your ranch," Sarah pointed out. "They can wait." Abby turned around. She took both of her sister's hands. Are you happy, Sarah? I'm teaching reading to the ranch hand's children twice a week. Sarah beamed. I have a horse of my own, and I have my sister back. I have never been happier in my life. Abby kissed Sarah's forehead. Let's go. They walked downstairs, out the front doors. They didn't take a carriage. Abby wanted to walk the land. The ceremony wasn't at the church in town. It was on the high ridge, overlooking the valley. When Abby crested the hill, she stopped. There were no politicians. There were no wealthy bankers from Austin. The guests were the people who mattered. Margaret Holt was in the front row, wearing a bright blue hat. The town doctor was there. Reverend Miller stood under an oak tree, holding his Bible. And lining the aisle were the ranch hands, the fencers, the cooks, the men and women who bled into the dirt to make the ranch survive. They had all washed their faces and put on clean shirts. They held their hats over their hearts as Abby walked past. At the end of the aisle stood Arthur. He wore a dark suit, but he looked comfortable in it. The hard, bitter lines around his mouth were gone. When he saw Abby, his breath hitched. He didn't hide it. He let the whole world see exactly how much he loved her. Abby walked up to him. He took her hands. His grip was warm and steady. Reverend Miller smiled. We are gathered here today to witness a true union. These two have already signed the papers. They have already passed the trials of the law. But today, they make a covenant of the heart. The Reverend spoke of duty and faith. But when it came time for the vows, Arthur and Abby didn't use the book. They had written their own. Arthur spoke first. Abby, he said, his voice carrying over the quiet breeze. I spent 5 years trying to buy safety. I thought, if I owned enough land, nothing could hurt me. But you taught me that the only true guarantee of a meaningful life is human respect and compassion. He looked deeply into her dark eyes. I promise to never put a wall between us again, Arthur vowed. I promise to respect your mind, your strength, and your independence. You are not my property. You are my equal, and I choose you, today and every day, for the rest of my life. Several of the ranch hands wiped their eyes. Margaret Holt nodded in fierce approval. Abby took a deep breath. She squeezed his hands. Arthur, Abby said. Her voice was crystal clear. It was the voice of a woman who had walked through hell and finally found the sun. When we first met, we made a trade, Abby said, smiling slightly at the memory. But love isn't a ledger. It isn't a debt to be paid. She looked out at the people gathered, then back to him. This was her truth, and she needed it spoken aloud. I choose you not because I needed a savior, Abby declared, her words deliberate and full of educational weight. I choose you not because I needed a roof, or money, or protection. I choose you because beside you I am allowed to be myself entirely. She stepped half an inch closer. We are equals in every decision, Abby continued explicitly. We will share the pain. We will share the triumph. True love is not a cage of necessity. It is the voluntary choice to stand by each other, as full and equal partners, every single day, even when no contract forces us to. Arthur smiled. It was a brilliant, unguarded thing. I do, Arthur whispered. I do, Abby replied. Then by the power vested in me, and clearly, by the power of your own free will, Reverend Miller laughed, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may seal the vows. Arthur didn't hesitate. He pulled her in and kissed her. It wasn't a polite society kiss. It was deep, real, and full of a quiet, burning joy. The hillside erupted into cheers. Hats flew into the air. The reception was held down by the main barns. Long wooden tables were set up in the grass. There was roasted beef, fresh bread, and barrels of cold beer. Fiddlers played fast, lively tunes. Arthur danced with Abby. He danced with Sarah. He even danced with Margaret Holt. much to the old woman's delight. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley, Arthur walked to the center of the yard. He climbed up onto a wooden crate. He whistled loudly. The fiddle stopped. The crowd quieted down, turning to look at the boss. Arthur held up a hand. "I have an announcement," Arthur said. "Today is a day about partnerships, about recognizing the truth." He looked out at the faces of his hands, the men who rode the fences in the freezing rain, the women who scrubbed the floors and cooked the meals. "For years, I believed this ranch was great because my name was on the iron gates," Arthur said. "But my wife has taught me a hard, necessary lesson. A name doesn't dig a well. A bank account doesn't gentle a horse. Sweat does. Labor does." He paced the length of the crate. "Labor creates wealth," Arthur stated, his voice ringing with a new, radical conviction. "The wealth of Montgomery Ranch belongs to the people who bleed into its dirt. We cannot claim to believe in equality if we do not practice it in our livelihoods." The workers exchanged confused, hopeful glances. "Effective." "Immediately," Arthur announced loudly. 20% of the net profits from the silver mines and the annual cattle drives will be placed into a trust, and that trust will be divided equally among every worker on this ranch, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender. If you work the land, you share in its bounty." Complete silence fell over the yard. It was a shocking, unprecedented declaration for Texas in 1878. A profit share for the laborers. Then one of the older vaqueros took off his hat. He let out a loud, piercing whistle. The yard exploded. Men were shouting. Women were cheering. They rushed the crate, clapping Arthur on the back, shaking his hand. It wasn't just a boss giving a bonus. It was a man recognizing their humanity, recognizing their worth. Abby stood by the edge of the tables. She watched the chaos. She watched her husband laughing, shaking hands with the men covered in dust. Arthur caught her eye through the crowd. He stepped down from the crate. He made his way through the cheering people, walking straight to her. He stopped in front of her. He was slightly out of breath. "Did I do that right?" he asked, a crooked smile on his face. Abby reached up. She touched the side of his face. Her thumb brushed his cheekbone. "You did that perfectly," Abby said. She leaned in and rested her forehead against his. The music started up again. The sky was turning a deep, rich purple. They stood there in the middle of the noise. Two people who had been broken by the world. Two people who had found each other in the mud and decided to build something beautiful out of it. "Come with me," Arthur whispered. He took her hand. They slipped away from the party, walking up the dark, quiet path toward the massive stone house. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It wasn't a tomb. It was just a home. And the doors were finally wide open. Texas, 1888. The Montgomery Ranch didn't look like a fortress anymore. It looked like a town. 10 years is a long time on the frontier. It's enough time for saplings to become shade trees. It's enough time for old scars to fade into white lines. And it is enough time to prove that a crazy idea wasn't so crazy after all. It was early morning. The air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming sage and fresh coffee. Abby sat on the wide, wraparound porch of the main house. She held a steaming mug in both hands. She was 44 now. There was silver in her dark hair, spun through like fine wire. The lines around her eyes were deeper. But they were laugh lines, earned through a decade of hard work and harder joy. She looked down the hill. A quarter-mile from the main house, nestled in a grove of oak trees, was a large stone building. It wasn't a barn. It had large, clean windows and a slate roof. Above the door was a painted wooden sign, the Preston Montgomery Free Clinic. Every morning, families from the ranch and from towns 20 miles away lined up there. They came with broken bones, with fever, with ailments that the old county doctor couldn't fix. They didn't come to see a nurse. Despite the laws in Austin, despite the grumbling of the medical board, the people of West Texas knew exactly who to call when death knocked on the door. They called Dr. Preston Montgomery. "You're up early," a voice said. Arthur walked out onto the porch. He was 52. His hair was mostly gray now, but his shoulders were just as broad. He handed Abby a fresh biscuit from the kitchen. "I was just thinking," Abby said, taking the biscuit, "about the clinic. We need to order more ether from St. Louis before the winter." Arthur sat down in the rocking chair next to her. "I'll wire the bank this afternoon. How is the new apprentice doing?" "Sarah's oldest boy." Abby smiled. "He has a steady hand. He doesn't flinch at the sight of blood. He'll make a fine doctor." Arthur chuckled softly. Down in the valley, the school bell rang. It was a sharp, clear sound that carried over the hills. The Preston Montgomery School was the largest free educational facility in the county. It was funded entirely by the profit-sharing trust Arthur had set up on their wedding day. Sarah was the headmistress. She was 29 now. The sickly girl who had coughed blood in a damp rented room was gone. She was a force of nature, strong, loud, and completely dedicated to the 40 children who sat in her classrooms. "Sarah's running them through their times tables today," Arthur noted, listening to the faint sound of children, voices drifting up the hill. "She doesn't let them slack off," Abby agreed. A little boy burst out of the front door of the house. He was 7 years old. He had Arthur's pale blue eyes and Abby's dark hair. He was missing a front tooth. "Mama, Papa," he yelled, waving a wooden toy horse. "Look, Uncle Tom carved it for me." Tom was the oldest ranch hand on the property. He had been there since Arthur's father built the first fence. "It's a fine horse, William," Arthur said, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair. "You go tell Uncle Tom thank you. And don't run in the mud." William didn't listen to the last part. He sprinted off the porch, his boots kicking up dirt as he raced toward the bunkhouses. Abby watched him go. Her heart swelled. William Preston Montgomery. He was growing up on a ranch where the men who worked the land owned a piece of it. He was growing up in a place where his mother was called a doctor and his aunt was a headmistress. He was growing up in a world they had built. Arthur leaned back in his rocking chair. He watched the workers moving around the lower pastures. The profit-sharing model had caused an uproar in 1878. The other wealthy ranchers had called Arthur a radical, a fool. They said his workers would get lazy. They were wrong. The Montgomery Ranch was the most productive, profitable estate in the state, because men don't work hard for a master. They work hard for themselves. "I had a letter from Austin yesterday," Arthur said, casually, blowing on his coffee. Abby raised an eyebrow. "Oh? The governor again?" "Silas Thorne," Arthur said. Abby stilled. Thorne had lost his judgeship after the trial. He had been investigated, fined, and disgraced. He lived in a small, rented house on the edge of the Capitol now. "What did he want?" she asked. Her voice was calm. The name didn't hold any terror for her anymore. "Money," Arthur said simply. "He asked for a loan," said his investments failed. "He appealed to my Christian charity." Abby snorted softly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him my charity was currently funding a school and a clinic," Arthur said, a hard edge to his smile. "I told him if he wanted a loan, he could come out here and ask the Workers' Trust Committee. Since they own 20% of the profits, they vote on the investments." Abby laughed, a real deep laugh. The thought of Silas Thorne having to beg a committee of ranch hands and cooks for money was poetry. "He won't come," Abby said. "No, he won't," Arthur agreed. The sun climbed higher. The morning mist burned off the valley. Arthur set his coffee mug down on the railing. He turned to look at Abby. He didn't look at the gray in her hair. He looked at the fire that still burned bright in her eyes, the fire that had saved him from himself. "Abby," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "Serious." Abby turned to him. "Yes?" "Do you ever think about that day in the rain?" he asked. "The day you walked 5 miles in the mud to find a foreman in a shack." Abby smiled gently. "I think about it every time it rains." Arthur reached out and took her hand. His fingers traced the calluses on her palm. "I once believed money was the only shield against the world," Arthur said. His voice was thick with emotion, but his words were explicit, stating the absolute truth he had learned over the last decade. "I thought if I hoarded enough land, enough silver, I could keep the pain out. But you taught me the hardest, most important lesson of my life." He looked her dead in the eye. "You taught me that the only true guarantee of a meaningful life is human respect and compassion." Arthur declared softly but firmly. "Money doesn't heal a wound. Power doesn't stop the storm. Only people do." Abby felt a lump in her throat. She squeezed his hand back. "And we use this land to prove it, Arthur," Abby replied, her voice carrying the weight of an educator, of a healer, of a woman who had changed the world around her. "We didn't just build a successful ranch. We built a place that stands for something." She looked out over the valley, at the clinic, at the school, at the men and women working with dignity. "No matter where someone comes from," Abby stated, making the lesson explicitly clear, "no matter if they are a wealthy man or a penniless widow, every single soul has the right to an education. They have the right to heal, and they have the right to be loved wholly, without conditions." Arthur smiled. It was the smile of a man who had finally found peace. "You're a stubborn woman, Dr. Montgomery," he whispered. "And you're a decent man, Mr. Montgomery." Abby whispered back. Down in the yard, William was running back toward the house. Tom, the old ranch hand, was walking behind him, laughing. The air was warm. The sky was vast and open. Abby leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder. They sat together on the porch, watching the life they had built. It wasn't perfect. There would be more storms. There would be droughts and hard winters. But they wouldn't face them alone. They had chosen each other. They had chosen the truth. And in doing so, they had turned a fortress of dirt and stone into a home that could heal the world, one piece of land at a time. The Wild West was never only about gunslingers and outlaws. It was also about love, loyalty, sacrifice, motherhood, forgiveness, and ordinary people finding hope in impossible times. On this channel, we bring you deeply emotional cowboy stories about frontier romance, family bonds, compassion between strangers, and the timeless strength of the human spirit. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
When the dust finally settles over the Texas plains, Abigail and Arthur's story leaves us with something deeper than romance, richer than wealth, and stronger than any contract signed on paper. It reminds us that true love is not born from convenience, power, or rescue. True love is built slowly through honesty, forgiveness, respect, and the courage to stand beside someone when the storm is at its worst. Abigail teaches us that dignity is something no debt, no judge, no man, and no hardship can take away unless we surrender it ourselves. She had every reason to break, every reason to stay silent, every reason to wait for someone else to save her. but instead she chose to fight for her sister, for her own worth, and for the truth. Arthur's journey shows us another kind of lesson, that a wounded heart can become its own prison. Pain may teach us caution, but if we let fear rule us, we may push away the very people who came to heal us. His story reminds us that strength is not about never being hurt. Strength is learning to trust again, to admit when we are wrong, and to become better because someone brave enough told us the truth. And perhaps the greatest meaning of this story is that compassion can change lives. A sick young woman was saved by love. A broken man found hope again. A woman who had been underestimated found her voice and used it not only for herself, but for others who had been silenced. In the harsh world of the Old West, where land, money, and power often decided a person's fate, this story reminds us that humanity is still the greatest force of all. So may we remember this: never judge a person by their poverty, their past, or their scars. Every heart carries a hidden battle. Every soul deserves dignity. And sometimes the people who walk into our lives during the darkest storm are the very ones who help us find our way home. If this Western tale touched your heart, please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, send this story to someone who loves emotional frontier romance, and subscribe to the channel for more cowboy stories about Western love, motherhood, family, compassion, sacrifice, and the unbreakable kindness between human beings.